There is a photograph taken sometime in the early 1950s that captures Glenn Ford standing on a Hollywood studio lot, dressed in a tailored suit, his posture composed, his expression giving nothing away. To anyone who looked at that photograph, he was exactly what the world believed him to be: a polished, dependable movie star at the height of his powers, the kind of man Hollywood manufactured for public consumption. But what that photograph could not show, what no camera could ever quite capture, was the other man living inside that same body. The soldier, the operative, the man who spent 3 decades walking 2 entirely separate lives, answering to 2 entirely different sets of demands, and never once allowing either world to fully see the other. For most of his career, Glenn Ford was described in remarkably consistent terms: reliable, authentic, controlled. Critics noted that he never seemed to be performing, that something in the way he occupied a role felt less like acting and more like inhabiting. Audiences trusted him in a way they did not always trust the louder, more theatrical stars of his era. And that trust, it turned out, was not entirely manufactured. It was the byproduct of a man who had learned, across decades of genuine discipline, how to hold himself together under pressure that most people in his profession would never come close to experiencing. What the public did not understand was that the steadiness they admired on screen had been forged somewhere far removed from any film set. Glenn Ford's military connection began early and ran far deeper than the carefully managed version of it that eventually found its way into the press. When he walked into a Marine Corps recruitment office in 1942, he was not performing patriotism. He was not making a calculated career move designed to soften his image during wartime. He was stepping out of one life and into another with a thoroughness that surprised everyone who witnessed it. He declined to use his status as an actor to seek a comfortable posting. When asked about his profession during the enlistment process, he did not mention Hollywood, did not mention the contracts he was leaving behind, did not attempt to leverage anything. He identified himself as an ordinary man, and he meant it. What followed was not the glamorous wartime service that the studio publicity machine would later try to construct around his name. Stories circulated for years about secret missions and distant war zones, the kind of embellished narrative that Hollywood always preferred when dealing with its icons. The reality was quieter and in many ways more demanding. Ford spent significant portions of his service involved in filming and documentation work, the kind of labor that required patience over heroism, discipline over spectacle. It was unglamorous work in the truest sense, and it suited something in him that the film industry had never quite known how to use. He was not looking for a story to tell later. He was doing a job, but here is where the double life truly began, because when the war ended and Glenn Ford returned to Hollywood, he did not sever the connection. He stayed in the reserves. He continued training. He continued advancing through the ranks through a combination of genuine competence and sustained commitment that had nothing to do with his celebrity. While his name was appearing on marquees across the country, while studio executives were building promotional campaigns around his image, while audiences were watching him opposite Rita Hayworth and registering something electric in the way he held himself back on screen, he was simultaneously embedded in a military world that operated on entirely different terms. A world where his fame was not only irrelevant, but would have been a liability if he had attempted to use it. The advancement was real. The promotions were earned through performance rather than granted as courtesy to a famous face. People who served alongside him during this period would later note that he approached military obligations with the same focused seriousness he brought to a difficult role, which is to say he treated it as something that required his full attention rather than a portion of it. By the time he had risen to a significantly higher rank, he had done so across a span of years during which he was simultaneously one of the most commercially successful actors in the American film industry. The two identities were not merely parallel. They were in genuine tension with each other, and he managed that tension without allowing either side to collapse. Consider what that actually required. The 1950s were the period of his greatest professional dominance. By 1958, his name sat at the absolute top of the box office, not on the strength of a single film, but because of a sustained string of consecutive successes that made him the safest investment in Hollywood. He was appearing in multiple films per year, working with directors who understood what he brought to a role, navigating an industry that was itself beginning to shift in ways that would eventually work against him. The schedules were relentless, the demands were constant, and beneath all of it, running in parallel without public acknowledgement, was a set of military obligations that required his physical presence, his mental attention, and his continued willingness to exist within a hierarchy that did not care about his box office numbers. The discipline required to maintain this is worth sitting with for a moment. Most actors of his stature in that era organized their entire existence around the cultivation and protection of their public image. Every public appearance was managed. Every interview was shaped. Every relationship was filtered through the question of what it would mean for the audience's perception of the star. Glenn Ford participated in this system to the extent that he had to, but something in him consistently refused to be entirely consumed by it. The military life was not merely a hobby or a secondary interest. It was a counterweight, a separate set of values operating beneath the Hollywood surface, a reminder that he existed as a person in contexts where performance was not the primary currency. His son Peter would later speak about growing up in a household where this duality was simply a fact of life, where his father might be preparing for a major film role one week, and then absent the following week for reasons that were not discussed in detail. The household had a particular quality of controlled silence around certain subjects, not the silence of deception exactly, but the silence of a man who had learned to keep different chambers of his life separate from one another. This was not unusual for men of his generation who had served during wartime, but in Ford's case, it extended far beyond the typical veteran's reticence about wartime experience. He was not simply keeping the past separate from the present. He was actively maintaining two present-tense lives simultaneously. What made this possible, at least in part, was the nature of the persona he had constructed on screen. The characters Glenn Ford played were almost never men who revealed everything. They were men of controlled surface, men whose emotional interiors were suggested rather than displayed, men who kept things together under circumstances that would have broken less disciplined personalities. This was not simply a performance choice. It was an expression of how he actually functioned. The restraint that critics sometimes read as limitation was in fact a deeply practiced mode of being in the world, developed across decades in an environment where revealing too much had genuine consequences. The relationship between his acting and his military discipline is not incidental. Those who analyzed his performances without knowing the full context of his life consistently noted something that they found difficult to articulate precisely. There was a quality in the way he inhabited a character that went beyond technical skill. It was the quality of a man who had been in real situations requiring real composure, who had learned to read rooms and navigate hierarchies and control his own responses in contexts that mattered beyond the frame of camera. When he played a man under pressure in The Big Heat, or a man carrying the weight of a darker moral world in Gilda, or a man standing at the edge of violence in film after film throughout the 1950s, what audiences were responding to was not only craft. It was something that had been formed by genuine experience outside any studio. The secrecy was not total. People within certain circles knew pieces of it. Military colleagues understood one dimension of who he was. Studio executives and directors understood another. His family lived alongside the consequences of the division without always understanding its full shape. But the public, the audiences who filled theaters to watch him, and who felt they understood something essential about Glenn Ford the man through Glenn Ford the actor, had almost no access to the reality of this parallel life. The carefully maintained separation between his two identities was one of the most sustained acts of privacy in a profession that theoretically demanded the opposite. It is worth asking why he maintained it so rigorously. The obvious answer is that military intelligence work, if that is indeed part of what occupied him during portions of this period, would have required confidentiality that was not optional. But the discipline extended even into areas where there was no formal requirement for secrecy. He simply did not discuss it. He did not use it for promotional purposes. He did not allow it to be woven into the mythology that studios were always eager to construct around their stars. At a time when wartime service was being heavily marketed as part of the public image of various Hollywood figures, Ford treated his military life as something that belonged to him rather than to the industry's image-making apparatus. There is something almost paradoxical in this, given what we know about the other dimensions of his private life. His marriages, 4 of them, were characterized by exactly the kind of distance and compartmentalization that defined his relationship to his military identity. Eleanor Powell, who gave up her own career at its peak to build a stable home around him, found herself living with a man whose inner world remained fundamentally inaccessible despite 16 years of proximity. The cracks that developed in that marriage were not the product of dramatic confrontations or visible betrayals, so much as the accumulated effect of being adjacent to someone who had mastered the art of not being fully known. The Glenn Ford who arrived home from a film set or from military obligations was not the same person Eleanor encountered on the rare occasions when the surface dropped even slightly. And the surface rarely dropped. Catherine Hayes married a man who was already in the process of being displaced from the industry center, already navigating the early stages of a shift that would eventually push him toward television and smaller roles. What she encountered was a version of the same fundamental inaccessibility, packaged differently but structurally identical. The compartmentalization that had allowed him to maintain separate lives for decades was not something that simply switched off in domestic contexts. It was the way he was built by that point, the way he had learned to survive in a world that required him to be multiple things to multiple people without any of those things bleeding into the others. Cynthia Hayward spent 7 years with a man who was past the peak of his public career, but still deeply embedded in the habits of a life divided. By the time they divorced in 1984, the military chapter had largely concluded in terms of active service, but the psychological architecture it had helped to construct remained entirely intact. You do not spend 30 years maintaining a double life, and then simply stop. The patterns become constitutive. The capacity for compartmentalization becomes indistinguishable from personality. What is remarkable, looking back across the whole of it, is how rarely the seams showed. There were moments, inevitably. People who knew him well enough and long enough could identify the places where the 2 versions of his life pressed against each other in ways that produced visible strain. William Holden, his closest friend from the early days, understood dimensions of Ford's existence that almost no one else was permitted to see. The friendship endured precisely because Holden never pushed past the boundaries that Ford maintained around certain subjects, and perhaps because Holden himself had his own carefully guarded interior. When Holden died in 1981, Ford lost not just a friend, but the one person who had existed in sufficient proximity to both of his worlds to understand what holding them together had actually cost. The cost was real. It expressed itself in the drinking that his son Peter would later acknowledge as a constant presence throughout his father's life, a way of managing the gap between the public performance and the private reality. It expressed itself in the marriages that each ended not with dramatic rupture, but with the quiet exhaustion of people who had tried to reach someone who had made himself fundamentally unreachable. It expressed itself in the gradual withdrawal of the later years, when the Beverly Hills house became less a home than a container for the accumulated weight of a life that had been lived for 3 decades in at least 2 registers simultaneously. The strokes that began to affect him in his later years were, in a grim way, the physical expression of what the years of divided living had done to him. A man who had spent decades maintaining extraordinary internal discipline, holding multiple identities in careful separation, found his body gradually refusing to sustain the control that had defined him. The same man who had once been known for the precision of his physical presence on screen, who had trained his body through military discipline and decades of work with horses and weapons and the demanding physicality of action films, now faced a body that was becoming unreliable. The irony was not lost on those who knew him. When he appeared in Superman in 1978 as Jonathan Kent, the adoptive father of a boy who would become a hero, Something in the performance registered differently than his earlier work had. He was playing a man whose entire function was to shape a child for a destiny that would exceed anything the father could fully comprehend, to offer guidance and love, and then to step back and allow something larger than himself to take over. It was a small role in terms of screen time, but it carried an emotional weight that seemed to draw on everything he had accumulated across his life rather than simply on his professional technique. Audiences who had no idea who Glenn Ford was, younger viewers encountering him for the first time in this context, responded to something in the performance that was difficult to name. It was the quality of genuine depth of a man who had actually lived inside the kind of complexity the role required. The ceremony held in 2006 to honor his 90th birthday brought together people from the film world who had known him across different decades. A video was prepared. Familiar faces gathered to acknowledge what he had contributed, and Ford himself could not attend. The distance between who he had been at the height of his powers and who he was in those final months measured in a way that was almost unbearable to witness. 3 months later he was gone, quietly in the house in Beverly Hills, with family present and with none of the noise that had once surrounded his name. The double life he had maintained for 30 years was never exposed in any dramatic sense. There was no revelation, no scandal, no moment when the two identities collided publicly and forced a reckoning. The secrecy held because he was genuinely gifted at maintaining it, and perhaps because the world he moved through was not, in the end, particularly interested in looking past the surface of what he presented. Hollywood wanted a reliable leading man. The military wanted a disciplined officer. His audiences wanted someone they could believe in. He gave each of these worlds what it required without any of them ever fully possessing him. What we are left with, looking back now, with more of the picture visible than any single person during his lifetime was permitted to see, is the portrait of a man whose greatest performance was not on any screen. It was the sustained, decades-long act of being multiple people simultaneously without losing hold of whatever it was that constituted the actual Glenn Ford beneath all of it. Whether he himself knew what that was, whether the years of compartmentalization had left him with clear access to his own interior or had gradually obscured it even from himself, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. What can be said is that the qualities audiences found most compelling in him, the restraint, the control, the sense of a man who was managing more than he was showing, were not manufactured for the screen. They were the residue of an actual life lived under genuine pressure. The stillness that made him watchable, that made critics struggle to explain why his performances felt more real than many of his contemporaries, was the stillness of a man who had learned that survival sometimes required you to show very little of what you actually were. Glenn Ford lived a double life for 30 years, and almost no one knew the full shape of it while he was living it. Not his wives, not his colleagues, not the audiences who believed they understood him through the characters he played. The man who taught the world's greatest superhero how to be human was himself, until the very end, something of a mystery. Not the theatrical kind that Hollywood prefers, not the manufactured enigma of a star who has been carefully packaged for public consumption, but the genuine kind. The mystery of a man who was more than any single version of himself that anyone was ever permitted to fully see.